Welcome to the Sleepy Stoic. Tonight we turn our attention to beginnings. Not just any beginning, but the beginning of Stoicism itself. The origin of a philosophy that would comfort emperors and slaves alike. A tradition that would span centuries and continents, offering guidance through plague and prosperity, through the collapse of empires and the quiet struggles of ordinary lives. We begin with a shipwreck. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, a merchant vessel made its way across the Mediterranean Sea. Aboard this vessel was a man named Zeno, a trader from the island of Cyprus, carrying a cargo of purple dye. The ancient world prized this dye, extracted from murex shells, worth more than its weight in silver. Zeno had built his fortune on such commerce, moving goods between the great cities of the ancient world. The ship never reached its destination. Somewhere off the coast of Greece, the vessel was destroyed. Perhaps it was a storm. Perhaps the ship struck rocks in waters the captain thought he knew. The ancient sources do not give us these details. What they tell us instead is that Zeno lost everything. His cargo sank beneath the waves. His wealth disappeared into the depths. The life he had built, the identity he had carried, the future he had planned, all of it was taken by the sea in a single catastrophic moment. Zeno survived. He made his way to Athens, a city he might have visited many times as a merchant, but never truly seen. Now he arrived with nothing, no cargo to sell, no wealth to cushion him, no clear path forward. He was a man stripped of his context, separated from the life he knew. In Athens, by chance or by some instinct he could not have named, Zeno found his way to a bookseller's stall. There he encountered the writings of Socrates, or more precisely, the accounts of Socrates written by Xenophon and others. Something in these texts spoke to him. Something in the questions they raised, in the manner of examination they employed, struck a chord in his shipwrecked soul. He asked the bookseller where he might find such a philosopher in Athens. At that moment, a philosopher named Crates of Thebes happened to be passing by. The bookseller pointed to him. "There," he said, "that is the kind of man you seek." Zeno followed Crates, and in doing so, he stepped onto a path that would lead him to found one of the most enduring philosophical traditions the world has known. Years later, reflecting on that shipwreck, on that moment when everything was taken from him, Zeno would say something remarkable. He would say that he made a prosperous voyage when he was shipwrecked. He would say that fortune drove him to philosophy. This is not the language of a man who merely survived disaster. This is the language of a man who came to see his disaster as redirection, as the unwanted, unwelcome, utterly necessary force that pushed him toward something he would never have chosen on his own, and could not now imagine living without. We often speak of philosophy as something we approach through reason, through careful thought, through intellectual curiosity. And it is those things. But for Zeno, philosophy came first as disruption, came as loss. It came as the absolute dissolution of the life he had known, creating space for something he had not known was possible. The story of Zeno's shipwreck is not just an interesting historical anecdote. It is the origin story of Stoicism, and it carries within it some of the most essential themes that would define the philosophy he would create. When we look closely at this beginning, we find that the circumstances of Stoicism's birth shaped its fundamental character. Zeno came to philosophy through loss. This matters. He did not come to it as a privileged young man with leisure time to contemplate abstract questions. He did not inherit a philosophical school from a wealthy family. He came to philosophy as a man who had built something, lost it entirely, and had to reckon with what remained. What remained was himself, his capacity to think, his ability to choose how he would respond to what had happened. His freedom paradoxically discovered in the moment when his external freedom seemed most constrained. This experience of loss as gateway would become central to Stoic thought. The Stoics would develop extensive practices for contemplating loss, for preparing the mind to meet disaster, for loosening our grip on external things. They called one such practice premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. This was not pessimism. It was the cultivation of resilience through honest acknowledgement of what could be taken from us. Zeno knew from direct experience that prosperity could vanish in an instant, that the things we build our lives upon can prove far less solid than we imagine, that the self we think we are, tied to our possessions and position and plans, is a fragile construction. The shipwreck taught him this not as abstract philosophy but as lived reality. And yet the shipwreck also taught him something else. It taught him that there is something in us that survives such loss, some core of ourselves that remains when everything external is stripped away. The ship sank. The cargo was lost. The merchant's identity dissolved. But Zeno himself survived. And in surviving, he discovered capacities he had not known he possessed. The capacity to begin again, to learn entirely new things, to build a life on a different foundation. When Zeno first encountered Crates, he was entering the world of Cynic philosophy. The Cynics practiced a radical form of philosophical life, rejecting conventional comforts and social pretensions, living with extreme simplicity, speaking uncomfortable truths to the powerful. Crates himself was known for his humor and gentleness, unusual among the Cynics, but he still embodied their core commitment to living in accordance with nature rather than social convention. For someone who had just lost everything, Cynic philosophy had a certain logic. If you own nothing, you have nothing to lose. If you refuse to invest your happiness in external things, those things have no power over you. The Cynics had chosen deliberately what Zeno had experienced by disaster. They had voluntarily simplified their lives to the point where fortune could not touch them. Zeno studied with Crates for some years. He learned the Cynic practices. He learned to question social conventions, to examine assumptions, to distinguish between what was natural and necessary versus what was merely customary. But something in him was not satisfied with the Cynic approach. He respected it. He learned from it, but it was not quite the philosophy he needed to build. He studied with other teachers as well. He learned formal logic from Diodorus Cronus. He studied the philosophy of Plato at the Academy. He engaged with the thinking of Aristotle's school. Zeno was building something in those years, synthesizing ideas from different traditions, testing them against his own experience and reasoning. Around the year 300 BCE, approximately 2 decades after his shipwreck, Zeno began teaching his own philosophy. He was by then in his 40s, a man shaped by years of study and contemplation. He did not establish his school in a private garden or rented building, as other philosophical schools did. Instead, he taught in a public colonnade in the Athenian marketplace, a covered walkway with painted walls called the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch. This choice of location tells us something important about the philosophy that would be named for that porch. Stoicism, from its inception, was not meant to be an esoteric teaching for a select few. It was offered publicly, freely, to anyone who would stop and listen. The Stoa Poikile was in the heart of Athenian public life. People passed through it constantly. Merchants, citizens, visitors to the city. Some would pause, listen for a while, and move on. Others would stay, return day after day, become students. The walls of the Stoa Poikile were decorated with paintings depicting various scenes from Greek history and mythology. These paintings showed battles, heroic deeds, mythological stories. They were part of Athens' public memory, visual reminders of the city's history and values. Zeno taught surrounded by these images of human struggle and triumph, of legendary figures facing their fates. We might imagine Zeno there in the early days of his teaching, standing in that painted colonnade, speaking to whoever would listen. What did he tell them? What philosophy had he forged from his years of study and his experience of loss? At the core of what Zeno taught was a conviction about human nature and the natural order of the universe. He taught that the universe itself is rational, ordered according to logos, a Greek word meaning reason or rational principle. This logos pervades everything. It is the pattern and purpose that runs through all of nature, from the movements of the stars to the growth of plants to the structure of human consciousness. Human beings, Zeno taught, participate in this universal logos through our capacity for reason. We are, in a sense, fragments of the divine reason that orders the cosmos. Our rationality is not separate from nature but is itself natural, part of the way the universe works. This had profound implications for how we should understand human life and happiness. If we are rational beings by nature, and if the universe itself is rationally ordered, then living well means living in accordance with both our own rational nature and the rational nature of the whole. The Stoics would develop various formulations of this basic insight. Live according to nature, live according to reason, live in agreement with the universe. These phrases point to the same fundamental idea. What made this philosophy Stoic rather than simply another version of the rationalism that ran through much of Greek philosophy was how Zeno applied this principle to the question of what we can and cannot control. This was perhaps the most important insight that emerged from his experience of the shipwreck. There are things in life that depend on us and things that do not depend on us. There are things we can control and things we cannot control. Happiness, Zeno taught, depends on understanding this distinction and organizing our lives accordingly. The merchant Zeno could not control the sea. He could not prevent the shipwreck. He could not save his cargo or preserve his wealth. These were external things, subject to fortune, to circumstances beyond his power to determine. What he could control was his response, his judgment about what had happened, his decision about what to do next, his attention, his effort, his character. This distinction between what is in our power and what is not would become the foundational principle of Stoicism. Later Stoics would articulate it in various ways. Epictetus, centuries after Zeno, would open his handbook of Stoic teaching with this distinction. Some things are up to us, he would write, and some things are not up to us. Our opinions, our impulses, our desires, our aversions, these are up to us. Our bodies, our possessions, our reputations, our positions in society, these are not up to us, at least not entirely. But Epictetus was building on what Zeno began. And what Zeno began was rooted in his shipwreck. He had learned in the most direct way possible that external things are precarious, that we do not truly possess them, we merely have temporary use of them, that fortune can take them at any moment, that building our happiness on such uncertain foundations is not wisdom but folly. Yet Zeno did not conclude that we should be indifferent to all external things in the way the Cynics were. This was one of the key innovations of his philosophy. The Cynics tried to eliminate desire for anything beyond the bare necessities of survival. Zeno developed a more nuanced view. Some external things, he taught, are natural for us to prefer. Health is preferable to sickness. Reasonable prosperity is preferable to poverty. Good relationships are preferable to isolation. These preferences are natural and appropriate. The Stoics would call such things preferred indifference. They are indifferent in the sense that they are not the essence of happiness, not the source of the good life. Virtue alone is sufficient for happiness. But among the indifferent things, external circumstances that neither make us good nor bad in themselves, some are naturally preferable to others. We can appropriately pursue health and reasonable prosperity and meaningful relationships, as long as we understand that these are not what our happiness fundamentally depends upon. This might seem like a subtle distinction, but it makes all the difference. It means that the Stoic does not withdraw from ordinary life, does not reject family or refuse work or disdain reasonable comfort. The Stoic engages with the world, pursuing appropriate goals, fulfilling social roles, working toward good outcomes. But the Stoic does all of this while maintaining an inner freedom, a core understanding that happiness comes from virtue, from the quality of our character and choices, not from the external outcomes we achieve. Zeno himself exemplified this balance. After his shipwreck, he did not remain destitute. He rebuilt a life, though a very different one than he had before. He became a teacher, gathering students, earning respect, eventually becoming a prominent figure in Athenian intellectual life. But the prosperity he built this time was rooted differently. It was not the foundation of his identity. It was not what his happiness depended upon. He had learned to hold such things more lightly. The Stoics would teach that we should act like the skilled archer. The archer's task is to aim well, to employ proper technique, to make the best shot possible. Whether the arrow actually strikes the target depends on many factors beyond the archer's control. The wind might shift. Someone might jostle the archer's arm. The target might move. The good archer focuses on what is up to her, the quality of her aiming and shooting, not on what is not up to her, whether external circumstances allow the arrow to hit. Similarly in life, our task is to exercise virtue in whatever circumstances we find ourselves, to act with wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation, to make the best choices we can with the information we have. Whether these choices lead to the outcomes we hope for depends on countless factors we cannot control. But our happiness does not depend on those outcomes. It depends on the virtue with which we act. This teaching must have struck a chord in ancient Athens, because Zeno attracted students. Among his early followers was Cleanthes, a former boxer who worked by night hauling water so he could study philosophy by day. Cleanthes would succeed Zeno as head of the Stoic school. There was also Aristo of Chios, brilliant but idiosyncratic, who would eventually break with orthodox Stoicism over certain points of doctrine. And there was Chrysippus, who would join the school after Zeno's death and systematize Stoic philosophy so thoroughly that later thinkers would say, if there had been no Chrysippus, there would have been no Stoa. But that development lay in the future. In those early years, it was Zeno alone, teaching in the painted colonnade, offering a philosophy forged from his experience of disaster and his years of study. What he offered was a way to live that acknowledged the precariousness of life while claiming an inner stability that no external circumstance could shake. This was not optimism. The Stoics were not optimists in any naive sense. They did not believe that everything happens for the best in some simple way. They acknowledged that terrible things happen, that people suffer unjustly, that the innocent are harmed, that natural disasters destroy without discrimination, that disease and death come for all. These were not facts to be explained away or softened with comforting illusions. Instead, the Stoics taught that we can meet these realities with equanimity, that we can maintain our freedom and dignity regardless of what happens to us. that no external force can make us less than we are unless we consent to it through our own judgments. This was a philosophy of resilience, born from a man who had been resilient, who had lost everything and discovered that he still had what mattered most. Zeno taught that the good life consists in virtue, and virtue consists in living according to reason and nature. But what does this mean practically? How does one actually do this? The Stoics would develop extensive practices and exercises to help people develop their capacity for virtue. But at the foundation was something simpler: attention. Pay attention to your judgments. Notice what you are saying to yourself about events. Notice the stories you tell yourself about what has happened and what it means. These judgments, these stories, these interpretations, this is where your emotional life comes from. Not from the events themselves, but from what you make of them. The shipwreck, considered simply as an event, is neither good nor bad. It is an occurrence in nature, like a storm or an earthquake. The suffering it causes comes from our judgments about it. The judgment that this should not have happened, that it is catastrophic, that everything is ruined, that the future is destroyed. These judgments create suffering beyond what the event itself necessitates. But we have some capacity to examine these judgments, to question them, to consider alternatives. What if this disaster is actually a redirection? What if what I have lost was not as essential as I thought? What if I am more capable than I knew of building something different? What if this unwanted change opens possibilities I could not have imagined? This is not positive thinking. This is not pretending that loss does not hurt or that disaster is secretly good. It is recognizing that our interpretation of events is distinct from the events themselves, and that we have some freedom in how we interpret what happens to us. This freedom is not unlimited. We cannot simply choose to feel however we wish, but we can examine our judgments, question our assumptions, consider alternative perspectives, and gradually cultivate a more resilient way of encountering the world. Zeno lived to be 72 years old. He spent the last decades of his life teaching in the Stoa Poikile, developing his philosophy, training students who would carry on his work. According to the ancient accounts, he remained vigorous and active until near the end. His death, like his shipwreck, became part of the lore surrounding the founder of Stoicism. The story goes that one day, leaving the Stoa, Zeno tripped and broke his toe. He was by then an old man, his body more fragile than it once had been. As he lay on the ground, he struck the earth with his hand and quoted a line from Greek tragedy. I come, why do you call for me?" Then he held his breath until he died. Modern readers might find this story puzzling or even disturbing. Why would breaking a toe lead to such a response? The ancient biographers who recorded this story saw it differently. They saw Zeno recognizing a signal from nature. His body was telling him something. It was time. He had lived a full life, accomplished what he set out to do, taught what he had learned. The broken toe was simply the occasion for acknowledging what was already true. His life was complete. Whether the story is historically accurate is less important than what it reveals about how the ancient Stoics understood their founder. They saw him as someone who maintained until the very end that philosophical composure, that clear-eyed acceptance of natural necessity, that willingness to meet whatever came without resistance or complaint. He had lived according to nature. When nature indicated it was time to die, he accepted that as readily as he had once accepted the shipwreck that had brought him to philosophy in the first place. After Zeno's death, the Athenians honored him with an unprecedented public funeral. They buried him at public expense and erected a tomb in the Ceramicus. the district where Athens buried its most distinguished citizens. The inscription on his tomb praised him for teaching that virtue is the only good, and that he lived his life according to his own teaching. This public honor from Athens is worth pausing over. Zeno was not Athenian. He came from Cyprus, always spoke with an accent, always carried the mark of being foreign. Yet Athens claimed him. The city that had produced Socrates and Plato and Aristotle recognized in this foreign merchant-turned-philosopher something valuable enough to honor with its highest gestures of respect. What Athens honored was not just philosophical brilliance, though Zeno had that. It was the way he had lived, the consistency between his teaching and his life, the character he had developed and demonstrated. He taught that the good life consists in virtue, and he lived virtuously. He taught that external things do not determine happiness, and he maintained his equilibrium through all circumstances. He taught that philosophy should be available to all who seek it, and he taught freely in a public place for decades. The Stoicism that Zeno founded would continue to develop after his death. His successors would refine and systematize his ideas. Chrysippus especially would give Stoic logic and physics their mature form, writing hundreds of books explicating every aspect of Stoic philosophy. The school would eventually split into different interpretations and emphases. It would spread beyond Athens to Rome and across the Mediterranean world. It would influence countless people across many centuries, from ancient slaves to modern thinkers who might not even realize they are working in a Stoic tradition. But it all began with Zeno's shipwreck, with that moment when everything was lost and something new became possible. With that recognition, articulated years later after much study and thought, that fortune had driven him to philosophy, that what seemed like pure disaster had been redirection toward what mattered most. This is why we return to this story, because we all face our shipwrecks, perhaps not literally, though some of us do, but metaphorically certainly. We all experience those moments when what we have built collapses, when plans fail catastrophically, when loss comes suddenly and completely, when the life we knew ends and we must somehow continue. We have arrived now at the deeper waters. We have traced the outline of Zeno's journey from Phoenician merchant to philosophical founder. We have stood with him amid the wreckage, witnessed his turn towards something beyond material fortune, and followed his footsteps to the Stoa Poikile, where a new tradition would be born. Now we must venture further into the philosophy itself, into the architecture of thought that Zeno began constructing beneath that painted porch. This segment invites us to slow down, to dwell within the foundational ideas that Zeno introduced to the world. We are not merely surveying historical facts now. We are entering into dialogue with concepts that have shaped human consciousness for over 2 millennia. These are ideas that were forged in the aftermath of personal catastrophe, tested in the marketplace of ancient Athens, refined through countless conversations, and eventually spread across the Mediterranean world to become one of the defining philosophies of Western civilization. Let us begin with what might seem a simple question, but one that contains remarkable depth. What exactly did Zeno teach? When those first students gathered around him in the painted colonnade, when merchants paused from their business to listen, when young Athenians sat at his feet instead of attending the more established schools, what were they hearing that compelled them so powerfully? The answer begins with Zeno's conception of philosophy itself. For Zeno, philosophy was not merely intellectual exercise, not entertainment for the leisure class, not clever debate for its own sake. Philosophy, as he understood it, was the art of living well. It was practical wisdom applied to the fundamental questions of human existence. How should we live? What matters? What can we control? What must we accept? How do we find peace amid uncertainty? These questions had been asked before, of course. The great Socrates had walked these same Athenian streets, questioning everything, seeking definitions of virtue and justice and courage. Plato had established his academy, exploring the realm of ideal forms and the nature of reality itself. Aristotle had created his systematic philosophy, categorizing knowledge, defining virtues as means between extremes, investigating every subject from logic to biology to ethics. Zeno knew these traditions. He had studied them. He absorbed what resonated with truth, and he set aside what seemed to him speculation untethered from lived experience. From the Cynics, particularly from Crates, he took the emphasis on virtue as sufficient for happiness, the rejection of conventional values, the focus on self-sufficiency and inner freedom. But he rejected the Cynics' extreme rejection of society, their sometimes theatrical poverty, their contempt for learning and refinement. From Plato and the academics, he took seriously the questions of knowledge and reality, of how we can know what is true, of what constitutes the good. But he found Plato's theory of forms too abstract, too removed from the concrete world of experience. From Aristotle, he appreciated the systematic approach, the careful reasoning, the attention to nature and natural law. But he found Aristotle's ethics too comfortable, too accommodating of external goods, too willing to say that wealth and health and good fortune contribute to happiness. What emerged from Zeno's synthesis was something distinctive, something that bore his own stamp, shaped by his own experience of loss and discovery. At the heart of Zeno's philosophy was a radical claim about happiness, about human flourishing, about what the Greeks called eudaimonia. Zeno taught that virtue alone is sufficient for happiness. Not virtue plus health, not virtue plus wealth, not virtue plus good reputation or pleasant circumstances or freedom from hardship. Virtue alone. This was not merely a theoretical position. This was a teaching born from his own shipwreck, from the moment when he lost everything that his old life had considered valuable. In losing his cargo, his wealth, his plans, his identity as a merchant, he had discovered something that could not be lost. And what could not be lost, he came to understand, was the only thing that could serve as a reliable foundation for human happiness. Virtue, in the Stoic sense that Zeno established, is not merely moral goodness as we might casually understand it today. It is not simply being kind or honest or helpful, though it includes these things. Virtue, for Zeno, was a kind of knowledge, a wisdom about how to live in accordance with nature, a condition of the soul characterized by perfect rationality and consistency. The Stoics would identify 4 cardinal virtues, though this categorization would be more fully developed by Zeno's successors. These were wisdom, the knowledge of what is truly good and bad and indifferent; justice, the disposition to give each thing its due, to act rightly toward others and toward oneself; courage, the strength to face what is difficult or frightening, to endure hardship without being diminished by it; and temperance, the proper ordering of desires, the capacity to want what is truly worth wanting and to refrain from what is not. These virtues were not separate qualities that one might possess in varying degrees. For Zeno, they were interconnected aspects of a unified condition of excellence. To truly possess one virtue was to possess them all. They were like facets of a single jewel, different angles from which to view the same fundamental human excellence. This unity of virtue was important for Zeno. It meant that human excellence was not a matter of balancing competing goods, of sometimes choosing wisdom over courage or justice over temperance. The virtuous person, the sage as the Stoics would come to call this ideal, possessed a coherent and integrated character. There were no internal contradictions, no competing motivations, no conflict between what one knows and what one desires. This sage, this perfectly wise person, represented an ideal that perhaps no human had ever fully achieved. Zeno himself did not claim to be a sage. Later Stoics would debate whether any historical person had ever reached this state of complete virtue. Some suggested that Socrates might have been a sage. Others were more skeptical. But the importance of the sage in Stoic philosophy was not primarily as a realistic goal that one expected to reach. The sage served as a standard, a north star by which to navigate, a clear vision of what human excellence looks like when fully realized. And here we encounter one of the challenging aspects of Zeno's teaching, one that would provoke criticism and mockery from other philosophical schools. Zeno taught that there was no middle ground between virtue and vice, between wisdom and foolishness, between the sage and everyone else. One either possessed virtue completely or one did not possess it at all. One was either wise or foolish, good or bad. There was no spectrum, no partial credit, no pretty good or better than most. This might seem harsh, even absurd. Surely, critics said, there are degrees of virtue. Surely someone who has made some progress toward wisdom is better off than someone who has made none. Surely someone who acts rightly most of the time is more virtuous than someone who acts rightly rarely. Zeno's response relied on a series of analogies that became famous in ancient philosophical debates. A person drowning just beneath the surface of the water is no better off than a person drowning in the depths. Both are drowning. A person one step from the exit of a dark cave is still in darkness until they step out into the light. Someone aiming at a target who misses by an inch has still missed just as surely as someone who misses by a mile. These analogies were meant to illustrate that virtue, as Zeno understood it, was not a quantitative matter but a qualitative one. It was not about doing virtuous actions more frequently, though virtuous actions would naturally flow from a virtuous character. It was about a fundamental transformation of understanding, a complete reorientation of values, a thorough integration of wisdom into one's character. But Zeno was not naive. He recognized that people exist in various states of moral development. He acknowledged that some people make progress toward virtue while others stagnate or regress. The concept of the prokopton, the one making progress, became important in Stoic thought. This was someone who had begun to understand Stoic teaching, who was working to align their life with virtue, who was making progress even if they had not yet reached the goal. Most people, however, were not even making progress. Most people, in Zeno's assessment, were trapped in a state of fundamental confusion about what matters. They pursued wealth as if it were good in itself. They fled poverty as if it were truly bad. They organized their lives around health, pleasure, reputation, power, comfort. They defined their happiness by circumstances outside their control. And consequently, they were buffeted by fortune, sometimes pleased when events went their way, sometimes distressed when they did not, never at peace, never free. This brings us to one of Zeno's most important and distinctive teachings, one that would become absolutely central to all later Stoic thought. This is the division of all things into three categories: good, bad, and indifferent. It is a simple classification, but its implications are profound and far-reaching. What is truly good? Only virtue, only the excellent condition of the rational soul. Only wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. What is truly bad? Only vice, only the corrupted condition of the soul. Only foolishness, injustice, cowardice, and lack of self-control. Everything else, without exception, is indifferent, neither good nor bad in itself. This means that health is indifferent, Sickness is indifferent. Wealth is indifferent. Poverty is indifferent. Pleasure and pain, life and death, reputation and obscurity, freedom and imprisonment, all of these are indifferent. They are not good or bad in themselves. They do not, in themselves, contribute to or detract from human happiness. This teaching struck many ancient listeners as obviously false, even perverse. How can health be neither good nor bad? How can wealth be indifferent? How can pain not be bad? The objections came quickly and forcefully from rival philosophical schools. Zeno's response was careful and nuanced. He was not saying that there is no difference between health and sickness, between wealth and poverty. He was not recommending that we be careless about these things or indifferent to them in the colloquial sense. He was making a specific philosophical claim about what truly constitutes human good and evil. To understand Zeno's position, we must recognize that he was redefining good and bad in terms of what can genuinely affect the quality of the soul, the character, the inner citadel of the person. Health can be used well or badly. Wealth can be used well or badly. A healthy, wealthy person can be vicious, cruel, foolish. A sick, poor person can be virtuous, wise, just. Therefore, health and wealth themselves are not what determines the quality of a human life. Virtue, however, cannot be used badly. Wisdom cannot make a person worse. Justice cannot be misapplied in the way that wealth can. This is why virtue alone deserves to be called truly good. It is the only thing that always and necessarily contributes to human flourishing. But Zeno introduced an important refinement to this stark division. Among the indifferents, some are preferred and some are dispreferred. Health is preferred to sickness, all else being equal. Wealth is preferred to poverty. Life is preferred to death. These things have what the Stoics called value, even though they do not have goodness. They are naturally in accordance with human nature. They are what a rational person would ordinarily choose if no question of virtue were involved. This concept of preferred indifference allowed Stoicism to avoid the extreme position that nothing matters except virtue. It allowed Stoics to engage normally in life, to pursue health and reasonable prosperity, to prefer living to dying, while maintaining that these things are not ultimately what determines happiness. A person could rationally prefer health but not be disturbed by illness. A person could work to earn a living but not be devastated by financial loss. A person could prefer to live but face death with equanimity. This is where Zeno's own experience becomes illuminating once again. His shipwreck deprived him of wealth, status, his cargo, his plans. These were all preferred indifference. Naturally, he would have preferred to keep them, but losing them did not harm him in the deepest sense. It did not make him less happy, less human, less capable of flourishing. In fact, it redirected him toward something more valuable, toward philosophy itself, toward the development of wisdom. The shipwreck, we might say, took away preferred indifference and led him toward genuine good. This is why he could say that fortune drove him to philosophy, why he could look back on the disaster not with bitterness but with something approaching gratitude. The loss of wealth had revealed that wealth was not essential to his well-being. The dissolution of his plans had freed him to discover a better way of living. This understanding of good, bad, and indifferent connects to another crucial element of Zeno's teaching, one that has echoed through Stoic thought ever since and has become perhaps the most practically applicable Stoic principle. This is the discipline of distinguishing between what is up to us and what is not up to us, between what is within our control and what lies outside it. Zeno taught that our judgments, our intentions, our choices, our responses are up to us. These constitute the domain of our power, the realm where we are free. Everything else, the entire external world, the actions of others, the movement of events, the outcomes of our efforts, all of this is not fully up to us. We may influence these things, we may have some impact, but we do not control them. This distinction might seem obvious when stated simply, but its implications are revolutionary. Most people live as if happiness depends on things outside their control. They need their health to remain intact, their wealth to grow, their loved ones to act in certain ways, their plans to succeed, their society to approve of them. They have placed their happiness in fortune's hands, and fortune is notoriously unreliable. The Stoic, following Zeno's teaching, places happiness only in what is up to them, in their own character, their own choices, their own responses to events. External things may be preferred or dispreferred, but they are not necessary for happiness. This means that the Stoic, at least in principle, cannot be made miserable by external circumstances. Fortune can take away wealth, health, reputation, even life itself. But fortune cannot take away virtue unless we surrender it. This is the source of Stoic freedom. Not political freedom, not freedom from constraint or hardship or difficulty, but inner freedom, the freedom of the will, the freedom to maintain one's character regardless of circumstances. It is a freedom that cannot be granted or removed by any external power. It is a freedom that exists even in prison, even in exile, even in pain, even facing death. Zeno himself exemplified this freedom. The shipwreck could not touch what was essential in him. The loss of his cargo could not diminish his capacity for wisdom. His displacement from Citium to Athens could not prevent him from living well. In fact, these external reversals became the occasion for his philosophical development, for his discovery of what truly matters. This teaching about control and freedom has sometimes been misunderstood as passive resignation, as an excuse not to engage with the world, not to try to improve circumstances, not to resist injustice. But this is not what Zeno taught. The Stoic engages fully with life, pursues appropriate goals, works to improve circumstances where possible. The difference is that the Stoic does not confuse these appropriate efforts with what constitutes happiness. Consider how this might work in practice. A Stoic might work diligently to maintain health, pursuing preferred indifference through reasonable means. But if sickness comes despite these efforts, the Stoic is not thereby made unhappy. The Stoic has done what was up to them, has exercised virtue in the pursuit of health, and that exercise of virtue is what matters. The outcome, health or sickness, is ultimately not up to them. Similarly, a Stoic might work to earn a living, to support a family, to contribute to society. These are entirely appropriate activities, consistent with human nature and social responsibility. But if financial reversal comes, if business fails, if poverty arrives, the Stoic has not thereby failed at happiness. What matters is the character with which one works, the wisdom applied to circumstances, the justice maintained in dealings with others, not the external outcomes that depend on countless factors outside one's control. This distinction liberates tremendous psychological energy. When we recognize that outcomes are not entirely up to us, we can release the anxiety that comes from feeling responsible for what we cannot control. We can focus instead on what genuinely is our domain: our intentions, our efforts, our character, our responses. We can work toward outcomes without being enslaved by them, prefer certain results without being devastated when they do not arrive. Zeno lived this teaching. After establishing his school, he became one of the most respected philosophers in Athens. He was honored by the city, offered citizenship, granted a golden crown and a bronze statue in recognition of his contributions. These were preferred indifference, pleasant circumstances, but not necessary for his happiness. When he died, reportedly at a very old age after injuring his toe and interpreting this as a sign that his time had come, he left a legacy that would outlive any bronze statue. But we should not imagine that Zeno's philosophy was merely about maintaining inner tranquility, about personal peace regardless of external circumstances. Zeno's teaching had a robust social dimension, a vision of human community and natural law that was quite radical for his time. Zeno taught that all human beings possess reason, and that this shared rationality makes all humans fundamentally kin. This was a revolutionary idea in a world divided by city-states, by Greeks and barbarians, by free and slave, by male and female. The Stoic cosmopolitanism that Zeno introduced suggested that one's fundamental community was not Athens or Citium or any particular city, but the cosmos itself, the universal city of rational beings. This meant that the bonds between humans were not primarily bonds of blood or nationality or custom, but bonds of shared rational nature. A slave might be closer kin, in the deepest sense, than a brother if the slave acted more rationally, more virtuously. A foreigner might be more truly a fellow citizen than a native-born Athenian. What mattered was not external status but internal character. Zeno even wrote a work called Republic, now lost except for fragments, in which he apparently described an ideal community of the wise. This community would have no need for many conventional institutions. There would be no temples, for the truly sacred is virtue itself. There would be no law courts, for the wise would have no disputes requiring external arbitration. There would be no money, for the wise would share what they had. Men and women would be equals, for rationality and virtue know no sex. These ideas were startling, even scandalous to many ancient readers. They suggested that conventional social structures were not natural necessities but rather accommodations to human folly. In a community of the wise, much of what we take for granted as essential to civilization would be unnecessary. Only because most people are not wise, because most people are confused about values and pursue indifference as if they were goods, only because of this widespread foolishness do we need the elaborate structures of law and custom and social control. This aspect of Zeno's teaching gives us insight into his view of nature and natural law. For Zeno, nature meant the rational order of the cosmos, the logos that structures reality and manifests in human reason. To live according to nature meant to live in accordance with reason, to align one's life with the rational pattern that governs the universe. This concept of natural law would become enormously influential, eventually informing Roman legal theory, Christian theology, Enlightenment political philosophy, and modern conceptions of human rights. The idea that there is a higher law than human convention, a law grounded in nature and reason, a law that applies to all rational beings regardless of their particular society. This idea traces back in significant part to Zeno and the Stoic tradition he founded. For Zeno, living according to nature meant recognizing what truly is good, bad, and indifferent. It meant developing virtue, the excellence of our rational nature. It meant accepting what is not up to us and taking responsibility for what is. It meant recognizing our kinship with all rational beings and contributing to the common good. It meant achieving a harmony between our individual character and the rational structure of reality. This harmony was not something imposed on nature from outside, not a conformity to arbitrary rules, but rather an alignment with what we most deeply are. Just as a tree flourishes by being a good tree, by realizing the nature of treeness, so a human flourishes by being a good human, by realizing our rational nature. Virtue is not contrary to nature but is the perfection of nature. This view stands in interesting contrast to some later Western philosophical and religious traditions that would see morality as a constraint on nature, virtue as a suppression of natural impulses, the good life as a constant battle against our lower selves. For Zeno, virtue is natural. It is vice that is unnatural, a corruption of reason, a failure to live as our nature intends. Of course, Zeno recognized that humans often do act against reason, that vice is common, that most people are foolish. But this does not mean that vice is natural in the sense of being in accordance with human nature. It means rather that humans, unlike trees or animals, can fail to actualize their nature. We can be irrational. We can make bad choices. We can develop vicious characters. This capacity for failure is, paradoxically, part of what makes virtue possible. Only a being that can choose badly can meaningfully choose well. Zeno's ethics, then, is grounded in his understanding of nature, of human nature specifically, and of reason as the characteristic human capacity. This connection between ethics and nature distinguishes Stoicism from moral philosophies that ground ethics in divine command, social contract, utility, or pure reason independent of natural considerations. For Zeno, to understand what we should do, we must first understand what we are. And what we are, most fundamentally, is rational beings living in a rational cosmos. We are parts of a larger whole, fragments of the universal reason that orders all things. Our individual rationality is a spark of the cosmic rationality, the logos that pervades everything. This means that when we perfect our reason, when we achieve wisdom and virtue, we are not just becoming better individuals. We are fulfilling our role in the cosmic order. We are participating consciously in the rational pattern of nature. This brings us to Zeno's understanding of fate and providence, topics that would be extensively developed by later Stoics but that have their roots in his teaching. Zeno taught that everything that happens is fated, determined by the causal chain of events that began with the initial ordering of the cosmos and continues through all subsequent moments. Nothing happens by chance. Everything unfolds according to necessity, according to the logos, the rational principle that governs all. This might sound like a depressing determinism, a view in which human choice is meaningless and everything is predetermined regardless of what we do. But Zeno did not understand fate this way. For Zeno, fate and freedom are compatible because freedom consists not in the ability to make events turn out differently but in the ability to align one's will with reason, to choose virtuously regardless of circumstances. The Stoics would use the analogy of a dog tied to a moving cart. If the dog chooses to run alongside the cart, it is both being pulled and exercising its own will in harmony with the cart's movement. If the dog resists and is dragged, it is still going where the cart goes, but now in conflict with the inevitable. We are like that dog. Events will unfold as they must. We can align our will with events, accepting and working with what comes, or we can resist and be dragged. Either way, events proceed. But in one case we are free, acting in accordance with reason, and in the other we are enslaved by our own resistance to reality. This teaching has profound implications for how we relate to the circumstances of our lives. It suggests that acceptance is not passive resignation but active alignment with reality. It suggests that we can be free within the constraints of fate because freedom is an inner condition, a quality of will and judgment, not an external circumstance. When Zeno's ship went down, the cargo was lost regardless of how he felt about it. That was fate, the necessary unfolding of natural causes, the movement of the cart. But his response to this loss was up to him. He could resist, could spend his life bitter about what fortune had taken from him, dragged along by circumstances while resenting them. Or he could accept, could see the loss as an opportunity, could align his will with what had happened and find meaning within it. He chose the latter, and in doing so exercised the only freedom that matters, the freedom of the rational will. This is not a cold or cruel philosophy, despite sometimes being caricatured as such. It is not telling people to suppress their emotions or pretend that losses do not hurt. It is offering a framework for maintaining one's character and peace of mind even when losses occur, even when pain is real, even when circumstances are difficult. Zeno himself experienced ordinary human emotions. The later Stoics would develop a detailed theory of emotions, distinguishing appropriate feelings from destructive passions. But the roots of this are in Zeno's teaching. He did not advocate becoming stone-like, unfeeling, emotionally dead. He advocated becoming rational, having one's emotional life properly ordered, responding to events with wisdom rather than with confusion about what is truly good or bad. The sage, in Zeno's conception, would still have preferences, would still experience feelings, but these would be appropriate to reality rather than based on false judgments. The sage might prefer health to sickness, but would not be disturbed by sickness because the sage knows that sickness is not truly bad. The sage might feel appropriately cautious in danger, but would not feel irrational fear because the sage knows that death is not an evil. This brings us to Zeno's understanding of emotion, a topic that would become highly developed in later Stoicism, but that begins with his foundational insights. For Zeno, destructive emotions, what the Stoics called path or passions, are not something separate from reason. They are not irrational forces that oppose reason. Rather, they are mistakes of reason, false judgments, errors in evaluation. When someone feels overwhelming fear, it is because they judge something to be a terrible evil when in fact it is at most a dispreferred indifferent. When someone feels crushing grief, it is because they judge that something truly bad has happened, that something essential to happiness has been lost. When someone feels consuming anger, it is because they judge that they have been seriously wronged, that something unjust has occurred that threatens their well-being. These emotions are based on judgments, and judgments can be corrected. This is why philosophy, understood as the cultivation of wisdom, can address emotional suffering. By correcting our judgments about what is good and bad, by truly understanding that only virtue is good and only vice is bad, we can transform our emotional lives. We can achieve the condition the Stoics called apatheia, not the absence of all feeling but freedom from destructive passion, emotional stability grounded in correct judgment. This might sound impossibly idealistic, as if Zeno were proposing that philosophical theory alone could overcome the deep emotional patterns built into human nature. But remember that Zeno himself had lived through a transformative experience. He had felt the loss of his cargo, had faced an uncertain future in a foreign city, had experienced the emotional impact of his shipwreck. The philosophy he developed was not an abstract theory disconnected from emotional reality. It was a response to emotional reality, a way of making sense of suffering and finding peace. What Zeno discovered was that his suffering over the loss of his cargo was not caused by the loss itself, but by his judgment that this loss was catastrophic, that it deprived him of something essential to his happiness. When he began to study philosophy, when he encountered the teaching that virtue alone is good, when he recognized that his capacity for wisdom had not sunk with his ship, his relationship to the loss changed. The facts did not change. The cargo was still lost. But the meaning of those facts, the judgment about their significance, this could change. And with this change in judgment came change in emotional experience. This is the therapeutic dimension of Zeno's philosophy, the sense in which Stoicism offers not just a theory about reality but a practice for living well. Philosophy, as Zeno understood it, is medicine for the soul. Just as medical treatment addresses physical illness, philosophical practice addresses the illnesses of the soul, the false judgments and destructive passions that prevent human flourishing. This therapeutic understanding of philosophy was not unique to Stoicism. Other Hellenistic schools, particularly the Epicureans, also understood philosophy as addressing human suffering and promoting well-being. But Zeno's approach was distinctive in its focus on virtue, its insistence that only vice genuinely harms us, its vision of radical freedom through alignment with reason and nature. The practices that would develop within Stoicism, practices like morning meditation on the day ahead, evening review of the day past, contemplation of difficulties before they arrive, regular reminders of mortality, all of these trace back to Zeno's understanding that philosophy must be lived, not merely studied. Ideas about good and bad, control and fate, virtue and indifference, these ideas must be internalized, must shape daily life, must become not just intellectual positions but lived convictions. Zeno's school at the Stoa Poikile became a place where this internalization could happen, where students could practice philosophy in community, where daily conversations and teachings gradually reshaped understanding and character. It was not a place of occasional lectures attended and then forgotten. It was a place of sustained engagement with fundamental questions, of regular practice, of gradual transformation. The physical setting mattered. The painted porch with its scenes of Athenian victories and mythological events provided a backdrop that connected philosophical inquiry to civic life, to history, to the stories that give meaning to existence. Students did not retreat from the world to philosophize. They stood at the edge of the marketplace, engaged with daily life, and brought philosophical reflection to bear on ordinary experience. This integration of philosophy and life, theory and practice, understanding and transformation, is central to Zeno's vision. Philosophy is not something separate from living, an academic discipline or intellectual hobby. Philosophy is the art of living well, and it must therefore address all aspects of life. How we relate to fortune, how we respond to loss, how we pursue goals, how we treat others, how we face death, how we understand our place in the cosmos. And at the heart of this art of living well is the cultivation of virtue, the development of wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. Everything else in Stoic practice serves this central purpose. We examine our judgments to align them with truth, to see clearly what is good and bad and indifferent. We practice accepting what is not up to us so that we can focus energy on what is. We remind ourselves of mortality so that we might live with appropriate urgency and appreciation. We contemplate difficulties in advance so that we will not be overwhelmed when they arrive. All of this serves the goal of becoming virtuous, of perfecting our rational nature, of achieving the excellence characteristic of human beings. Zeno understood that this path is difficult. He did not promise easy answers or quick transformations. The development of wisdom takes time, requires sustained effort, demands honesty about one's own failings and confusions. Most people will remain imperfect, will continue to make progress without reaching completion, will struggle with false judgments and destructive passions throughout their lives. But the struggle itself is worthwhile. Even imperfect progress toward virtue is valuable. Even partial understanding of Stoic principles can improve life. Even someone who remains far from being a sage can benefit from recognizing what is truly up to them, from understanding the difference between goods and indifference, from practicing acceptance of what cannot be changed. This realistic acknowledgement of human limitation gives Stoicism a practical accessibility that complements its idealistic vision. Yes, perfect virtue is the goal, and perhaps only the sage truly achieves happiness. But the rest of us can still make progress, can still apply Stoic principles, can still find benefit in philosophical practice. We can become better even if we never become perfect. Zeno's own life exemplified this realistic idealism. He was greatly respected, honored by Athens, influential in shaping a new philosophical tradition. But he did not claim to be a sage. He continued to teach, to engage with questions, to develop his ideas. He remained a student of philosophy even as he became a teacher, remained aware of the difficulty of achieving perfect wisdom even as he articulated what such wisdom would entail. The school he founded would continue after his death, would be led by a succession of teachers who would develop and refine Stoic doctrine. Cleanthes, Zeno's student and successor, would contribute hymns and teachings that emphasized the divine nature of the logos, the rational principle that orders all things. Chrysippus, the third head of the school, would become known as the second founder of Stoicism for his systematic elaboration of Stoic logic, physics, and ethics. Later Stoics like Panetius and Posidonius would adapt Stoic teaching for Roman audiences, would soften some of its more demanding aspects, would integrate insights from other philosophical traditions. But all of this later development would build on the foundation that Zeno laid, on the core insights about virtue and indifference, control and acceptance, reason and nature. The basic structure of Stoic thought, the framework within which later refinements would occur, was established by Zeno in those early days at the Stoa Poikile. And this framework emerged from his experience of disaster, from the shipwreck that destroyed his old life and made possible his new one. This is worth dwelling on, worth returning to, because it illustrates something profound about the relationship between suffering and wisdom, between loss and discovery. Zeno did not choose to be shipwrecked. He did not want to lose his cargo. If given the choice, he presumably would have preferred to complete his voyage successfully, to continue his career as a merchant, to live out the life he had planned. The shipwreck was not something he welcomed, not something he sought, not something he initially interpreted as fortunate. But in retrospect, with the wisdom that came from philosophical study and reflection, he could see the disaster differently. He could recognize that what seemed like catastrophic loss had actually redirected him towards something more valuable. The life he lost was a life organized around preferred indifference, around wealth and commerce and material success. The life he found was organized around genuine goods, around virtue and wisdom and philosophical understanding. This does not mean that disaster is always beneficial, that every loss leads to something better, that we should welcome suffering as opportunity. Such a view would be naive and would minimize real harm. People suffer genuinely from loss, from illness, from injustice, from violence. These are real dispreferred indifference, things that rational people would prefer to avoid. But what Zeno's example shows is that even genuine disaster need not destroy happiness, need not prevent human flourishing, need not diminish what is most essential in us. Loss of preferred indifference, even severe loss, even multiple losses, does not touch virtue. It does not prevent wisdom, does not make justice impossible, does not eliminate courage, does not destroy the capacity for temperance. In fact, hardship can become the occasion for developing these virtues more fully, for testing them, for proving their reality. The shipwreck tested Zeno. It placed him in circumstances where he could easily have become bitter, despairing, broken. Instead, it became the catalyst for his transformation, the beginning of his philosophical journey. We return now to the texture of Stoic thought as it continued to unfold in the years following its foundation. The philosophy that emerged from Zeno's shipwreck was not a static doctrine delivered complete in a single moment. Rather, it grew organically through dialogue, refinement, and the pressing questions that students brought to the painted porch. What began as one man's response to catastrophe became a living tradition of inquiry, one that would adapt and deepen as it encountered new minds and new circumstances. By the time Zeno had been teaching for a decade, Stoicism had developed a recognizable shape. It was known not merely as ethical advice or spiritual consolation, but as a comprehensive philosophy that addressed the fundamental questions of human existence. What is the nature of reality? How should we understand knowledge and truth? What constitutes a good life? These were not separate inquiries but interwoven aspects of a unified vision, each supporting and illuminating the others. The Stoics understood that philosophy could not be merely theoretical. A teaching that remained only in the realm of abstract thought, never touching the ground of lived experience, was incomplete. Zeno insisted that understanding must lead to transformation. The goal was not to accumulate clever arguments or to win debates, but to become a certain kind of person. Philosophy was a way of life, and the test of any teaching was whether it made one wiser, calmer, more resilient, and more virtuous. This practical orientation shaped every aspect of Stoic teaching. When students came to the Stoa with questions about anger or grief or fear, they were not merely given techniques for managing emotions. They were led into deeper inquiries about the nature of judgment, the structure of value, and the relationship between our beliefs and our suffering. The Stoics saw that surface-level interventions, while sometimes helpful, could not produce lasting change. What was needed was a thorough reordering of understanding itself. Consider the student who arrives troubled by anxiety. The anxious mind races ahead into imagined futures, constructing scenarios of failure or loss or humiliation. It treats these mental projections as though they were present realities, generating distress about events that have not occurred and may never occur. The untrained response might be to offer reassurance or distraction. But the Stoic approach goes deeper. First, there is the examination of what is actually happening. Right now, in this present moment, what is the reality? Not the imagined future, but the immediate actuality. Often, the anxious person discovers that the present moment itself contains no catastrophe. The distress is generated by thoughts about what might happen, not by what is happening. This recognition alone can create a small space of clarity, a momentary respite from the tyranny of imagination. But the Stoics do not stop with this observation. They probe the beliefs that fuel the anxiety. What judgments are being made about the imagined future events? What is being treated as catastrophic? Often, anxiety reveals itself to be rooted in the assumption that external circumstances determine one's well-being. The loss of money, reputation, health, or approval is treated as genuinely devastating, as incompatible with a good life. The Stoic teaching challenges this assumption directly. The distinction between what is truly good and what is merely preferred becomes crucial here. The Stoics argued that virtue alone is good in the strictest sense. Wisdom, justice, courage, and self-discipline are goods because they perfect our rational nature and cannot be used badly. They are always beneficial, always choice-worthy, sufficient by themselves for a well-lived life. Everything else, regardless of how desirable or useful, belongs to a different category. Health, wealth, reputation, relationships, even life itself are what the Stoics called preferred indifference. They are natural objects of preference. All else being equal, we reasonably pursue them and try to maintain them. They contribute to the smoothness and ease of life. But they are indifferent to our fundamental well-being because they do not, in themselves, make us better or worse people. More importantly, they can be used well or badly. Wealth can fund generous acts or selfish indulgence. Health can be employed in service or squandered in vice. These external goods are tools whose value depends entirely on how they are used. This framework transforms the landscape of anxiety. If virtue is the only true good, and virtue is entirely within the domain of our choices and responses, then genuine harm becomes much narrower than we typically imagine. We cannot be truly damaged by circumstances, only by our own corruption. The loss of money does not injure us unless we respond with cowardice or dishonesty. The loss of reputation does not diminish us unless we abandon our integrity in response. Even the loss of life, while naturally to be avoided when possible, does not constitute ultimate defeat if we face it with dignity and reason. This is not a teaching that comes easily or all at once. It requires sustained reflection and repeated practice. The habitual patterns of valuation run deep. We have been trained since childhood to treat external circumstances as though they determine our happiness. Our culture reinforces this constantly. Success and failure are defined by outcomes in the world, not by the quality of our character. So the reorientation of value that Stoicism requires feels initially strange and difficult. Yet there is something immediately liberating in the Stoic perspective, even for the student who has not yet fully internalized it. To hear that your well-being does not ultimately depend on things outside your control, that you possess within yourself the resources for a good life regardless of circumstances, this offers a kind of hope that conventional reassurance cannot provide. It does not promise that bad things will not happen. It promises something more robust, that you have the capacity to remain intact through whatever happens. The Stoics developed various practices to help students move from intellectual understanding to lived realization. One such practice, which we have touched upon before but bears deeper examination, is the contemplation of adversity. The Latin term is premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. Despite its somewhat ominous name, this practice is not about cultivating pessimism or inviting disaster. It is about preparing the mind for the inevitable challenges of human existence. The premise is simple: we will face difficulties. Loss, illness, betrayal, failure, and death are part of the human condition. No amount of careful planning or good fortune can insulate us from every misfortune. Given this reality, we have a choice. We can proceed through life hoping to avoid hardship, remaining unprepared and therefore vulnerable to being overwhelmed when difficulties arrive. Or we can acknowledge the nature of existence, familiarize ourselves in advance with the shape of possible adversities, and cultivate the understanding and resilience that will allow us to meet them skillfully. The practice is not morbid rumination. It is not spending hours dwelling on all the terrible things that might befall us, working ourselves into a state of dread. Rather, it is a calm, philosophical examination conducted from a position of present stability. We take time to reflect. What would I do if I lost my livelihood? How would I respond if someone I trust betrayed me? How might I face a serious illness? What do I truly need to live well? These reflections serve multiple purposes. First, they reduce the shock of adversity when it arrives. The mind that has already contemplated a possibility is less likely to be completely undone by it. There is a strange comfort in recognition, even of difficult circumstances. Ah, yes, I knew this was possible. I have thought about this before. That familiarity creates a small foothold of stability in the midst of crisis. Second, the practice helps us distinguish between genuine catastrophe and mere inconvenience. When we honestly examine what we would do if we lost our wealth, we often discover that we would manage. We would adjust, simplify, find new ways forward. The imagined disaster reveals itself to be survivable. This recognition undermines the power of anxiety. The thing we feared as unbearable turns out to be merely difficult. This is not trivial. Much of our suffering comes from believing ourselves incapable of bearing what life might bring. When we discover our own resilience, even hypothetically, we become less fragile. Third, premeditation cultivates gratitude. When we clearly envision the absence of what we currently have, we appreciate its presence more fully. The health we take for granted becomes precious when we contemplate its loss. The people in our lives become more dear when we acknowledge their mortality and our own. This is not gratitude born of comparison with those who have less, which can carry an element of superiority or relief at another's suffering. It is gratitude born of recognizing the contingent, temporary nature of all conditions. What we have now, we might not have tomorrow. This recognition does not poison the present with fear. It enriches it with awareness. Marcus Aurelius practiced this kind of contemplation regularly. In his private writings, he reminded himself that everything he encountered might be seen for the last time. The people he met might not be there tomorrow. His own life might end before another day passed. These were not gloomy thoughts, but clarifying ones. They helped him maintain perspective, appreciate what was present, and avoid wasting time on trivial conflicts and petty concerns. The practice also had another dimension for Marcus. As emperor, he bore immense responsibilities and faced constant pressures. The contemplation of adversity helped him prepare mentally for the challenges of leadership. He reflected on the difficulty of dealing with ungrateful or deceptive people. He reminded himself that others would act from ignorance or selfishness, and that he should not be surprised or outraged by this. By anticipating these difficulties, he equipped himself to respond with patience and reason rather than reactive anger. This brings us to another dimension of Stoic practice that developed under Zeno's teaching and became central to the tradition: the cultivation of appropriate responses. The Stoics recognized that we cannot always control what happens to us, but we can train ourselves to respond skillfully rather than reactively. This training requires both understanding and practice. We must grasp intellectually why certain responses are preferable, and we must rehearse those responses until they become more natural. Consider anger, which the Stoics examined with particular care. Anger presents itself as a justified response to wrongdoing. Someone has acted unjustly, and our anger seems to be the appropriate recognition of that injustice. Moreover, anger often feels empowering. It energizes us, focuses our attention, and can motivate action. Why would the Stoics counsel against it? The Stoic analysis of anger is nuanced. They distinguish between the initial impression of harm, which arises automatically, and the assent to anger, which is a choice. When someone insults us or treats us unfairly, there is an immediate physiological response. We feel a rush of heat, a tightening in the chest, an impulse to retaliate. This initial reaction is not itself anger in the full Stoic sense, and it is largely involuntary. What happens next, however, is within our control. Anger proper, according to the Stoics, involves judgment. It is the decision that we have been genuinely harmed and that the person who harmed us deserves punishment. It includes the belief that our angry response is justified and that indulging our aggressive impulses is appropriate. This judgment and the actions that flow from it are chosen, even if the choice happens so quickly that it feels automatic. The Stoic argument against anger rests on several observations. First, anger clouds judgment. The angry person sees the situation through a distorting lens. Details that might explain or mitigate the offense are overlooked. Alternative interpretations are dismissed. The angry mind is rigid, certain, and closed. This is not a state conducive to wise action. Decisions made in anger are frequently regretted later, when clarity returns. Second, anger is painful to the one who experiences it. The Stoics did not deny that wrongdoing occurs or that others sometimes act badly, but they questioned whether responding to wrong action by making oneself miserable was rational. Anger is a kind of suffering we inflict on ourselves in response to the actions of others. It allows others to disturb our tranquility, to take up residence in our minds, to continue harming us long after the initial offense has passed. This seems neither dignified nor wise. Third, anger interferes with effective response. When we react from anger, we often make situations worse. We say things that damage relationships beyond repair. We take actions that escalate conflict rather than resolving it. The Stoics did not counsel passivity in the face of wrongdoing. They believed in justice and in acting to prevent or correct injustice. But they argued that such action is most effective when it proceeds from reason rather than anger. The calm, deliberate response is more likely to achieve its goal than the vengeful one. Finally, anger rests on questionable judgments about harm. If virtue is the only true good and vice the only true evil, then the person who treats us badly has not actually harmed our well-being in the deepest sense. They may have inconvenienced us or frustrated our preferences, but they have not damaged what matters most. Moreover, the person who acts unjustly harms themselves by corrupting their own character. This recognition can transform anger into something closer to pity or concern. Epictetus offered his students a practical approach to working with difficult people and situations that might typically provoke anger. He suggested that we remind ourselves, when encountering obstinate or unpleasant behavior, that we are not encountering something unexpected. Difficult people exist. This is simply a fact about the world. To be surprised or outraged when we encounter them is as irrational as being surprised that stones are hard or water is wet. Moreover, Epictetus pointed out that difficult people act as they do because they believe they are pursuing their own good. They may be mistaken about what is truly good, operating from confusion or ignorance, but they are not acting from pure malice. Even the person who seems to delight in causing harm believes, at some level, that doing so serves them in some way. They are, in Epictetus's view, pitiable rather than hateful. They are mistaken about the nature of good and evil, and that mistake will harm them regardless of what they do to us. This perspective does not require us to condone bad behavior or to refrain from responding to it. If someone acts unjustly, and we are in a position to correct that injustice or prevent future instances of it, the Stoic would say we should act. But our action should be measured, rational, and aimed at improvement rather than revenge. We might think of it as a teacher correcting a student or a doctor treating an illness. The goal is not to inflict suffering but to restore right order. Seneca, in his writings on anger, emphasized the importance of catching the emotion early. The longer anger burns, the harder it becomes to extinguish. The person who notices the first stirrings of anger and pauses, who deliberately refuses to feed the emotion with additional judgments about how terrible the offense was and how justified the anger is, can often let the feeling subside without much struggle. But the person who rehearses the grievance, who tells and retells the story of the injustice to themselves and others, who nurtures the anger as though it were precious, will find it increasingly difficult to let go. This is where practice becomes essential. Intellectual understanding of why anger is unhelpful does not automatically prevent us from becoming angry. The habits of reaction run deep, but we can train ourselves gradually. We can start with small irritations, the minor frustrations of daily life that might ordinarily provoke us. When we feel the first stirring of annoyance, we can pause, take a breath, and choose a different response. We can ask ourselves whether the situation genuinely warrants an emotional reaction or whether we might let it pass without engagement. Over time, with consistent practice, the pause between stimulus and response grows longer. What once would have automatically triggered anger now creates a space for choice. We find ourselves less reactive, less easily disturbed. This is not suppression or pretense. We are not simply hiding anger behind a false smile. We are actually becoming less angry because we are changing the underlying judgments that generate anger in the first place. The same principles apply to other difficult emotions. Anxiety, as we discussed earlier, can be addressed by examining and revising the judgments that fuel it. Grief, while natural and not to be entirely eliminated, can be moderated by clear thinking about loss and impermanence. Envy dissolves when we understand that others' possessions or advantages do not diminish us. Each emotion has its own structure, its own pattern of judgment, and can be approached with patient inquiry and practice. The development of Stoicism under Zeno and his immediate successors involved not only the refinement of ethical teachings, but also the elaboration of a complete philosophical system. The Stoics divided philosophy into three interconnected domains: logic, physics, and ethics. This tripartite structure was not arbitrary. Each domain supported and illuminated the others, and together they formed a coherent understanding of reality and how to live within it. Logic in the Stoic system encompassed more than formal reasoning. It included the study of language, the nature of truth and falsehood, the criteria for knowledge, and the methods of argument. The Stoics were sophisticated logicians who developed theories of propositions, conditionals, and logical inference that would influence the history of logic for centuries. But their interest in logic was not purely academic. They saw clear thinking as essential to living well. The connection between logic and ethics is straightforward once we recognize that emotions and distress arise from judgments. If our judgments are confused or false, we will experience unnecessary suffering. If we cannot distinguish between sound and unsound arguments, we will be vulnerable to persuasion by sophistry. We will believe things that are not true, and those false beliefs will generate false emotions and misguided actions. Therefore, training in clear thinking is training in well-being. The Stoics developed detailed accounts of how knowledge is acquired and how we can distinguish between reliable impressions and unreliable ones. They argued that some impressions carry their own guarantee of truth. When I am directly perceiving something under good conditions, and the impression is vivid and compelling in a certain way, I can assent to it with confidence. But many of our impressions are not of this clear, self-evident type. Many are interpretations, inferences, assumptions. These require scrutiny. The practice of examining impressions became central to Stoic training. When an impression arises in the mind, we do not immediately accept it as true. We pause and investigate. What exactly is being claimed? Is this a report of direct perception or an interpretation? What assumptions am I making? Is there another way to understand this situation? This practice of sustained inquiry prevents us from being carried along by every passing thought or feeling. Physics, the second domain of Stoic philosophy, dealt with the nature of reality. The Stoics were materialists of a sort. They believed that only bodies exist, though they understood body more broadly than we might today. For the Stoics, even qualities and forces were material in nature, though made of extremely fine matter. They conceived of the universe as a unified, living whole permeated by a rational principle they called logos. This materialist metaphysics might seem to have little connection to ethics, but for the Stoics the connection was profound. They believed that understanding the nature of the universe was essential to understanding our place within it and therefore to understanding how we should live. If the universe is rational, ordered by an intelligent principle, then our own rationality connects us to the fundamental nature of reality. To live according to reason is to live in harmony with the universe itself. The Stoic conception of nature provided the foundation for their ethics. When they spoke of living according to nature, they meant something quite specific. They meant living in accordance with our rational nature, which is our distinctive human capacity. Other animals live by instinct and conditioning. Humans alone have the ability to reflect on their impressions, to deliberate about action, to understand universal principles, and to choose their responses based on that understanding. To fail to use this capacity or to use it badly is to fail to live as humans should. But living according to nature also meant understanding our place in the larger order. The Stoics observed that we are not isolated individuals but parts of larger wholes. We belong to families, communities, and ultimately to the universe itself. Our well-being is connected to the well-being of these larger systems. The completely selfish life, concerned only with personal advantage, is not a flourishing life even for the selfish person, because it violates our social nature. This recognition of interconnection led the Stoics to embrace what they called oikeiosis, a term difficult to translate precisely but referring to the process of appropriation or familiarization. The idea is that we naturally care for ourselves and recognize ourselves as objects of appropriate concern. This self-regard is not selfishness but a healthy recognition of our own worth and interests. However, this circle of concern naturally expands if properly developed. The infant cares only for itself. As the child grows, concern extends to family members. Later, it may extend to friends, fellow citizens, and ultimately, in the fully developed person, to all rational beings. The sage, the ideal Stoic wise person, experiences all humans as belonging to a single community, the cosmopolis or world city. This expansion of concern is not sentimental. It is based on the recognition that all rational beings share a common nature and that we are all, in a sense, kin. This ethical vision had practical implications for how Stoics engaged with society. While Stoicism cultivated inner freedom and independence from external circumstances, it did not counsel withdrawal from social and political life. On the contrary, active engagement in one's community was seen as a natural expression of human nature. Many prominent Stoics held political office or served as advisors to rulers. They saw public service as an opportunity to contribute to the common good and to practice virtue in challenging circumstances. At the same time, Stoicism provided resources for maintaining integrity and equanimity within the often corrupt and tumultuous world of politics and public life. The Stoic practitioner understood that they could not control outcomes in the political realm. They could not guarantee that their proposals would be adopted or that justice would prevail. What they could control was their own conduct. They could speak truthfully, act justly, and maintain their principles regardless of pressure or consequence. This combination of engaged action and inner independence is one of the most distinctive features of Stoic ethics. The Stoic is neither the hermit who withdraws from the world nor the worldling who is consumed by ambition and completely identified with external success and failure. The Stoic acts in the world while maintaining perspective about the relative importance of worldly outcomes. They do their best to contribute to good results while understanding that the true measure of their life is not those results but the quality of their choices and character. As Stoicism developed and spread beyond Athens, it adapted to new contexts while maintaining its core principles. The philosophy that began as Zeno's response to personal catastrophe became a resource for countless others facing their own challenges. Some encountered Stoicism through formal study, sitting at the feet of teachers and working through philosophical arguments. Others encountered it more casually, through conversations, letters, or the example of Stoic practitioners. In every case, the appeal was similar. Here was a teaching that promised not to eliminate the difficulties of life, but to provide the understanding and resilience needed to face those difficulties with wisdom and dignity. The story of how Stoicism emerged from Zeno's shipwreck reminds us that transformation often comes through crisis. The comfortable life, proceeding smoothly according to plan, rarely prompts deep questioning or significant change. It is when our plans fail, when circumstances force us into unfamiliar territory, when we lose what we thought we needed, that we become open to new ways of understanding and being. The shipwreck that seemed like disaster became the gateway to a life of greater depth and purpose. This pattern, which Zeno exemplified, would be repeated countless times in the lives of those who encountered and embraced Stoic philosophy. We have walked through the dramatic reshaping of Zeno's life, followed the development of his philosophical school, and traced the evolution of Stoic thought through generations of teachers and practitioners. Now we arrive at a question that must have occurred to Zeno himself as he sat beneath that painted porch, speaking with anyone who would listen. What does all of this mean for how we actually live? Philosophy, after all, is not merely an intellectual exercise. The Stoics were abundantly clear on this point. Zeno did not escape the wreckage of his merchant vessel only to construct elegant theories disconnected from the texture of daily existence. He sought something more urgent, more necessary. He sought a way of living that could withstand the next shipwreck, whatever form it might take. The practical applications of Stoicism begin with a fundamental recognition. Life will present us with circumstances we did not choose and cannot control. This is not pessimism. This is simply observation. The waves do not ask our permission before they rise. The wind does not consult our preferences before it blows. And yet, within this field of uncontrollable forces, there exists a space of remarkable freedom. Consider how Zeno himself must have practiced this principle in the early days of his teaching. He had lost his cargo, his ship, his fortune, his expected future. These were external circumstances, entirely outside his control once the storm began. But his response to these circumstances, his interpretation of their meaning, his choice of what to do next, these remained within his power. Fortune drove him to philosophy, he said, but that driving was not coercion. It was invitation, and Zeno chose to accept. This distinction between what we control and what we do not forms the bedrock of Stoic practice. Epictetus, centuries after Zeno, would articulate this with crystalline clarity. Some things are up to us, he taught, and some things are not up to us. Our opinions, our impulses, our desires, our aversions, these belong to us. Our body, our property, our reputation, our position, these do not, at least not completely. The practical wisdom here is profound. Most human distress arises from attempting to control what cannot be controlled, or from neglecting what can be. We rage against the weather. We despair over aging. We torment ourselves over what others think. We treat these external circumstances as though our happiness depended on bending them to our will. And in doing so, we exhaust ourselves against immovable realities. But there is another way. We can learn to direct our attention and effort toward what actually lies within our power. Not with resignation, but with clarity. Not with passivity, but with focused engagement. Imagine a person who loses a position at work. The loss itself is an external event. Perhaps it resulted from economic forces, organizational restructuring, or any number of factors beyond individual control. The Stoic does not pretend this loss does not matter. Losing a source of income and daily purpose is genuinely difficult. But the Stoic distinguishes between the event itself and the response to it. The event is complete. It has already happened. No amount of worry or anger will reverse it, but the response remains entirely open. Will this person interpret the loss as evidence of personal failure, allowing it to corrode their sense of worth? Will they become bitter, resentful, paralyzed? Or will they recognize this as an external occurrence that says nothing definitive about their character, their capabilities, or their future? This is not positive thinking. This is not pretending difficulty does not exist. This is the practice of locating your true self, your capacity for choice and judgment, in its proper place. You are not your job. You are not your bank account. You are the one who decides what these things mean. The practical application of this principle requires daily attention. It is not enough to understand the concept intellectually. The distinction between what we control and what we do not must be practiced in small moments before it becomes available in large crises. Consider the simple experience of waiting. You are expecting an important message, perhaps a response to something you have sent, a decision that affects your plans. The message does not arrive when you anticipated. Minutes become hours. You check repeatedly. Your mind spins possible explanations, most of them troubling. Here is a perfect opportunity for Stoic practice. The arrival of the message is not within your control. You have already sent your part. You have already done what you could do. The timing of the response depends on factors external to you, other people's schedules, their priorities, circumstances you cannot see. But your reaction to the waiting, that is entirely yours. You can practice returning your attention to what is actually in front of you. You can notice the impulse to check again and choose not to. You can observe your mind's tendency to construct anxious narratives and decline to believe them. You can use this small moment of powerlessness to strengthen your understanding of where your real power lives. This is not suppression of feeling. If anxiety arises, it arises. The Stoic practice is not to wage war against your own emotions, but to recognize that you need not be ruled by them. You can acknowledge the feeling and still choose your action. You can experience impatience and still practice patience. Zeno himself would have had countless opportunities for this kind of practice. Building a philosophical school from nothing required patience. Students came slowly. Understanding developed gradually. Recognition took time. At each point where frustration might have taken hold, where the desire for faster progress might have created suffering, Zeno had a choice. He could exhaust himself wishing circumstances were different, or he could fully engage with circumstances as they were. This brings us to another essential practice, one that the Stoics called living in accordance with nature. This phrase can sound abstract, but its practical meaning is quite specific. It means recognizing what you are and acting consistently with that recognition. You are a human being. This means you are rational, social, mortal, and embodied. You have certain capacities and certain limitations. You exist within time, within a community, within a physical world that operates according to laws you did not write. To live in accordance with nature means to align your expectations and efforts with these fundamental realities. Consider mortality, for instance. Every person you love will die. You yourself will die. This is not morbid fixation. This is simple acknowledgement of what is true. The Stoics practiced remembering death, not to become gloomy, but to become present. When you remember that your time with someone is finite, you pay different attention to that time. When you remember that your own days are numbered, you spend them differently. A person who forgets mortality often lives as though there will always be time later. Time to reconcile, time to begin, time to say what needs saying. They postpone what matters, treating the present moment as mere preparation for a future that never quite arrives. Then suddenly time runs out, and they discover too late that life was happening all along. In those moments they treat it as preliminary. The Stoic practice of remembering death is not meant to create fear or sadness. It is meant to wake you up to the value of what you have right now. This day, this hour, this person in front of you, this work in your hands. Not someday, today. Another practical dimension of Stoic living involves what the philosophers called preferred indifference. This concept resolves an apparent paradox. If external things are not truly good or evil, if virtue is the only real good and vice the only real evil, does that mean we should be completely indifferent to everything external? Should we not care whether we are healthy or sick, prosperous or poor, honored or scorned? The Stoics said no, that is not what it means. It is natural and appropriate to prefer health to illness, sufficiency to poverty, good reputation to bad. These things are genuinely preferable, but they are not good in the deepest sense because they do not make you a better person simply by being present, and their absence does not make you worse. You can be wealthy and vicious. You can be poor and virtuous. External circumstances are materials to work with, not measures of your worth. The practical wisdom here is liberating. You can work toward preferred outcomes without being enslaved to them. You can make reasonable efforts to maintain health, earn a living, and build relationships, while recognizing that these efforts do not guarantee results, and the results do not determine your fundamental well-being. Imagine someone training for a competition. They practice diligently. They prepare thoroughly. The competition matters to them. This is entirely appropriate. The desire to perform well is natural. The effort to improve is admirable. But then the day arrives and something goes wrong. An injury, an unexpected difficulty, factors beyond their control. They do not achieve the outcome they work toward. Here is where the concept of preferred indifference becomes practical. This person can acknowledge genuine disappointment. They preferred winning. They worked toward it. But if they have understood themselves as fundamentally defined by their effort, their discipline, their response to difficulty rather than by the external outcome, then this disappointment, while real, does not become devastation. Their worth did not depend on winning. Their character was built in the preparation, not awarded by the result. This is how Stoics navigate a world of uncertain outcomes. They participate fully, preferring certain results, working toward them with complete engagement. But they hold the outcomes lightly, knowing that their character is measured by how they play, not by what score appears on the board when time runs out. Another essential practice involves attention to impressions. The Stoics understood that we do not directly experience reality. We experience impressions of reality, and then we add judgments to those impressions. This gap between impression and judgment is where our freedom lives. Something happens. Let us say someone speaks sharply to you. That is the event. Immediately, an impression forms. You heard certain words in a certain tone, but then, almost instantly, judgments begin to attach. This person disrespects me. This is unfair. I am being attacked. These judgments are not the same as the original impression. They are additions, interpretations, stories you tell about what the words mean. The Stoic practice is to notice this process, to catch the moment between impression and judgment, to recognize that your interpretations are not facts, they are choices. Perhaps the person spoke sharply because they are distressed about something unrelated to you. Perhaps they did not realize how their words would sound. Perhaps they meant something quite different from what you assumed. Or perhaps they did intend to be unkind, but that fact about them need not determine your response. This practice requires something like meditation, though the Stoics did not use that word. It requires a quality of attention to your own mental processes. You must learn to watch your mind making its judgments, and in that watching, you discover that you are not identical to those judgments. You are the awareness that observes them, and in that awareness you can choose differently. Marcus Aurelius practiced this attention to impressions constantly. In his personal writings, we find him reminding himself again and again to see things as they are, not draped in the judgments that create unnecessary suffering. A famous dish, he notes, is just a dead fish. A royal robe is just sheep's wool dyed with shellfish blood. These observations are not cynical. They are exercises in seeing clearly, stripping away the projections and assumptions that cloud direct perception. When you practice this in daily life, you discover how much of your distress comes not from what happens, but from what you tell yourself about what happens. Someone cancels plans. That is the fact. But then you might add, this means they do not value me. They are unreliable. I am not important to them. These additions create suffering, and they might be entirely inaccurate. The Stoic practice is not to suppress these interpretive thoughts, but to recognize them as interpretations rather than facts, and to question them. Is there another way to understand this situation? What do I actually know for certain? What am I adding? This questioning is not meant to make you passive or credulous. Sometimes people do act badly. Sometimes your initial interpretation is correct. But even then, the practice of recognizing interpretation as interpretation gives you freedom. You choose your response consciously rather than reacting automatically from an unexamined story. Another practical application involves the morning and evening practices that many Stoics maintained. Zeno would have established rhythms for his own reflection, practices that helped him maintain his philosophical orientation amid the demands of daily life. A morning practice might involve contemplating the day ahead, not just planning activities, but preparing mentally for difficulties. You will encounter people who are confused, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, Marcus Aurelius wrote. But this is not surprising. They act this way from ignorance of good and evil. Having reminded yourself of this, you are less likely to be derailed by behavior that is, after all, entirely predictable. This is not cynicism about human nature. It is realism. People act from their current understanding. When their understanding is limited or distorted, their actions will reflect that. You do not have to take their behavior as a personal assault or as evidence that the world is fundamentally wrong. You can recognize it as the inevitable result of how they currently see things and respond with patience rather than outrage. The evening practice offers a different opportunity. Before sleep, you might review the day that has passed. Not to judge yourself harshly, but to observe with clarity. Where did I act in accordance with my principles? Where did I stumble? What could I understand differently? This is not guilt. This is learning. Each day becomes material for philosophical development. Seneca wrote of this practice in detail. He described how he examined his day each evening, asking himself what faults he had cured, what vice he had resisted, in what respect he had become better. This inquiry, done with honesty but without cruelty toward oneself, gradually shapes character. You become conscious of patterns you might otherwise repeat endlessly. You notice where you consistently fall short of your own standards, and in that noticing, you create the possibility of change. The practical applications of Stoicism also extend to relationships. Zeno founded his school in a public space, teaching whoever came to listen. This was not accidental. The Stoics understood human beings as fundamentally social. We are not isolated atoms who happen to collide. We are members of communities, participants in a shared human project. Our well-being is intertwined with the well-being of others. This understanding generates practical obligations. You have a responsibility to act justly toward others, not because justice will necessarily be rewarded, but because justice is part of what it means to be fully human. You are rational and social. To act unjustly is to act against your own nature, to fragment yourself internally. But the social dimension of Stoicism is not only about obligation. It is also about perspective. When someone acts in ways that trouble you, the Stoic practice is to remember that they are human like you. They want to avoid suffering. They want to live well. They act from their current understanding of how to do that. If their understanding is mistaken, that is unfortunate, but it does not make them your enemy. It makes them your fellow student in the school of life, struggling with the same essential questions you struggle with. This perspective does not require you to accept harmful behavior. You can set boundaries. You can protect yourself and others. You can work to prevent injustice. But you can do all of this without the corrosive addition of hatred or contempt. You can oppose someone's actions while recognizing their humanity. Marcus Aurelius returned to this practice constantly. He ruled an empire, which meant dealing regularly with betrayal, incompetence, and opposition. Yet he reminded himself that anger toward others is impractical. They act from their own reasoning. If their reasoning is correct, you have no cause for anger. If their reasoning is mistaken, they are acting from ignorance, and ignorance calls for teaching, not anger. This does not mean you become passive in the face of wrongdoing. It means you respond effectively rather than reactively. Anger clouds judgment. It makes you less capable, not more. You can take strong action, you can correct and prevent and protect, all without the suffering that anger inflicts on the one who feels it. Another practical application involves relating to your own judgments and desires. The Stoics understood that much of what we call desire is actually opinion. You do not simply want things. You hold beliefs about what having those things would mean. You think that if you achieve a certain position, you will finally feel secure. You believe that if you acquire a certain possession, you will finally feel satisfied. These beliefs are usually mistaken. The wanting itself is not the problem. The problem is the belief that satisfaction lies in the external thing rather than in your own character and understanding. When you get the position or the possession, you discover that the feeling of accomplishment or satisfaction is temporary. Soon you are wanting something else, convinced once again that the next thing will finally deliver what you seek. The Stoic practice is to examine your desires, to ask what you truly want beneath the surface wanting. Usually what you actually want is not the thing itself, but a feeling you believe the thing will provide. Security, respect, peace, joy. And these feelings, the Stoics understood, cannot be reliably provided by external circumstances. They arise from internal conditions, from your own character and understanding. This does not mean you should eliminate all desire for external things. Remember the concept of preferred indifference. You can prefer comfort to discomfort, success to failure, health to illness. But you can hold these preferences lightly, knowing that even if you do not get what you prefer, your fundamental well-being does not depend on it. You are capable of tranquility in either circumstance if you maintain your philosophical understanding. This is the deeper meaning of Zeno's statement that fortune drove him to philosophy. He lost the external things he had worked to accumulate, but in losing them, he discovered something that could not be lost, something that no storm could drown. He discovered that his capacity for wisdom, for virtue, for meaningful engagement with life, did not depend on cargo ships or favorable winds. It depended only on how he chose to understand and respond to whatever circumstances arose. This is what Stoicism offers to anyone facing difficulty. Not a promise that external circumstances will improve, though they might. Not a technique for avoiding suffering which cannot be avoided, but a way of understanding yourself and your situation that allows you to maintain your integrity, your clarity, your fundamental well-being, regardless of what fortune brings or takes away. We have traveled together through the story of Zeno, through the waves that took his cargo and the wisdom that replaced it. We have stood at the threshold of the Stoa Poikile, listening to the voice of a man who lost his ship and found his calling. We have watched as a school of thought emerged from personal catastrophe, as philosophy arose from the wreckage of material fortune. Now, as we move toward the close of our reflection, we return not to summarize but to deepen, to let the story of Stoicism's birth settle into understanding that continues beyond this telling. The shipwreck that brought Zeno to Athens was not merely a biographical detail. It was a pattern, a demonstration of what the Stoics would later articulate as the fundamental condition of human existence. We live in a world where circumstances shift without warning, where what we build can be destroyed, where fortune and misfortune are woven together in ways beyond our prediction or control. Zeno's loss was sudden and complete, but it was not unique. What made it significant was not the disaster itself, but what he chose to do in its aftermath. When Zeno said that fortune had driven him to philosophy, he recognized something essential about the relationship between adversity and wisdom. Loss creates space. It clears away the familiar structures that usually occupy our attention. It removes the routines and certainties that normally define our days. In that clearing, in that emptiness left by what has been taken away, something else becomes possible. Not guaranteed, but possible. The space itself is neutral. What fills it depends on where we turn our attention, on what we seek when the old answers no longer suffice. Zeno turned toward philosophy not because he was naturally inclined to abstract thought, not because he had always dreamed of becoming a teacher or founding a school. He turned toward philosophy because he was searching for something that could not be shipwrecked. He was looking for a kind of value that did not depend on the cooperation of winds and waves, on the arrival of cargo, on the fluctuations of commerce and circumstance. He was looking for something internal, something that could be cultivated and maintained regardless of external fortune. This search led him to the teachings of the Cynics, to Crates and the radical simplicity of a life stripped to essentials. It led him to Stilpo and the Megarian school, to questions about logic and language and the nature of reality. It led him through years of listening and learning, through the process of absorbing different philosophical traditions and finding what resonated, what addressed the questions his shipwreck had made urgent. And eventually, it led him to develop his own synthesis, his own vision of what philosophy could offer to those seeking stability in an unstable world. The Stoa Poikile became the physical home of this vision. The painted porch was a public space, open and accessible, a colonnade where anyone could stop and listen. There were no barriers to entry, no requirements of wealth or status, no need for formal enrollment or payment of fees. You simply showed up. You stood or sat within the shelter of the columns. You listened to Zeno speak about virtue and reason, about living according to nature, about the distinction between what is truly good and what merely seems good from a limited perspective. The teachings that emerged in that painted porch would eventually be called Stoicism, named for the place where they were first articulated. But the philosophy itself was not about a location. It was about a way of understanding human life, a framework for navigating the inevitable challenges of existence with wisdom and resilience. The core principles that Zeno established became the foundation for generations of Stoic thinkers, a tradition that would evolve and deepen while maintaining its essential character. The Stoic understanding of virtue as the only true good represented a fundamental reorientation of values. Zeno taught that most of what we pursue, most of what we fear losing, belongs to the category of preferred indifference. Health and wealth, reputation and comfort, these things are naturally preferable. We are not wrong to prefer them, but they are not good in the deepest sense because they can be used badly, because they do not by themselves contribute to the quality of our character or the wisdom of our choices. True good, in Stoic terms, is found only in the excellence of our reasoning and willing, in the quality of our understanding and the integrity of our intentions. This is what cannot be shipwrecked. This is what remains available even when everything else is lost. External circumstances can remove our possessions, damage our bodies, take away our loved ones, destroy our plans. But they cannot remove our capacity to think clearly, to respond with wisdom, to maintain our character in the face of whatever happens. This teaching might seem abstract, perhaps even cold, when stated as philosophical principle. But it emerged from lived experience. It emerged from Zeno standing in Athens with nothing, realizing that he could be destroyed by his loss or transformed by it. It emerged from the recognition that his previous life, organized around commerce and material success, had been built on foundations that could collapse. The shipwreck revealed the fragility of that foundation. Philosophy offered something more stable. When we face our own shipwrecks, the smaller and larger disasters that interrupt our plans and expectations, we encounter the same choice Zeno faced. We can experience the loss purely as deprivation, as the removal of something we needed or valued. We can organize our response around the desire to restore what was taken, to return to the way things were before the disruption. Or we can ask what the loss reveals, what it teaches, what possibilities it opens by clearing away what had previously occupied all our attention and energy. This is not to suggest that loss is good, that we should welcome disaster or minimize genuine harm. The Stoics understood that preferred indifference are genuinely preferable. Health is better than illness. Security is better than danger. The presence of loved ones is better than their absence. To say that these things are indifferent to virtue is not to say they do not matter at all. It is to say they are not the deepest thing, not the foundation on which a good life must be built. Zeno's shipwreck demonstrates this distinction. He did not celebrate the loss of his cargo. He did not claim that the destruction of his merchant business was a positive event in itself. But he recognized that the loss had redirected him towards something more valuable than what he had lost. The fortune that drove him to philosophy was fortune in both senses, the event itself, which seemed like misfortune, and the larger pattern of his life, which was shaped for the better by that apparent misfortune. This paradox sits at the heart of the Stoic approach to adversity. We cannot choose what happens to us. We cannot prevent loss or guarantee that our plans will succeed. We cannot control the winds and waves, the decisions of other people, the accidents and illnesses and disasters that are woven into the fabric of existence. But we can choose what we do with what happens. We can choose where we turn when the familiar structures collapse. We can choose whether to seek only restoration of what was lost or to remain open to what might be found in the searching. The painted porch where Zeno taught stood in the agora, the marketplace and public square of Athens. This location was deliberate, not accidental. Philosophy was not meant to be a private pursuit or an escape from the world of commerce and politics. It was meant to be lived in the midst of ordinary life, applied to the actual circumstances that people faced in their daily existence. The Stoa was a threshold space, neither fully public nor fully private, open to the noise and traffic of the marketplace yet offering shelter and a place to pause. When we think about integrating Stoic wisdom into our own lives, this location matters. Philosophy is not something we do only in moments of calm reflection, only when we have time set aside for contemplation. It is something we bring to the marketplace, to the encounters and challenges and decisions that fill our days. The principles that Zeno articulated under the painted porch were meant to be tested in actual situations, applied to real dilemmas, used as tools for navigating the complexities of human relationships and responsibilities. The dichotomy of control, which would become one of the most fundamental Stoic teachings, addresses this practical dimension directly. Epictetus, teaching centuries after Zeno, would frame it clearly. Some things are up to us and some things are not up to us. What is up to us includes our judgments, our intentions, our responses, our use of impressions. What is not up to us includes our bodies, our possessions, our reputation, the outcomes of our efforts. Wisdom begins with recognizing this distinction and organizing our values accordingly. Zeno's Shpwreck illustrated this dichotomy perfectly. The cargo was not up to him. The storm was not up to him. The destruction of his merchant business was not up to him. These belonged entirely to the domain of external circumstances, of events that follow their own causes and patterns regardless of his preferences or efforts. But his response was up to him. His interpretation of the disaster was up to him. His decision to enter the bookshop, to listen to philosophy, to seek out teachers, to eventually develop his own school, all of this belonged to the domain of his own agency. This distinction does not make adversity easy or painless. It does not eliminate the natural emotional responses to loss and disappointment. The Stoics understood that initial reactions happen involuntarily, that we feel the impact of events before we have time to apply philosophy. But they taught that we are not bound by those initial reactions, that the space between stimulus and response is where wisdom operates, where we choose what to do with what we feel, what meaning to assign to what has happened. Living according to nature, another core Stoic principle, meant accepting this basic structure of reality. Nature includes both order and change, both pattern and unpredictability. Things grow and flourish and decay. Storms arise. Ships sink. Bodies age and fail. People we love die. Fortunes rise and fall. This is not a flaw in the design of the universe. This is how existence actually works. To live according to nature means to align our expectations with this reality rather than demanding that the world conform to our preferences. But living according to nature also means recognizing our own nature as rational beings capable of wisdom and virtue. We are not mere passive recipients of whatever happens. We are not simply subject to forces beyond our control. We have the capacity to understand, to evaluate, to choose our responses, to cultivate character that remains stable through changing circumstances. This capacity is what Zeno dedicated his teaching to developing in his students. The cultivation of wisdom is a gradual process, not a sudden transformation. Zeno spent years learning before he began teaching. He absorbed the insights of different philosophical traditions. He thought carefully about what he had experienced and what it revealed about human life. He developed a coherent framework that integrated logic, physics, and ethics into a unified vision. The school he founded was a place for this kind of sustained development, for the long work of shaping character and refining understanding. When we return to the image of the shipwreck, we see it now with greater depth. The literal shipwreck that brought Zeno to Athens becomes a metaphor for all the ways our plans fail. Our expectations are overturned. Our sense of control is revealed as partial and limited. We build our lives as we build ships, with care and effort and reasonable hope. We set out on voyages with destinations in mind, with cargo we value, with purposes that organize our activity. And sometimes the storms come. Sometimes what we built is destroyed. Sometimes we find ourselves standing in a foreign city with nothing familiar left to hold on to. These moments are not failures of our planning or evidence of our inadequacy. They are encounters with the basic structure of existence, with the fact that we are finite beings in a world much larger than ourselves, subject to forces and patterns we did not create and cannot fully predict. The question is not whether such moments will arrive. The question is what we will do when they do. Will we spend our energy demanding that things should have been different, that the storm should not have come, that we should have been spared this particular disaster? Or will we ask what becomes possible now, what we might learn or discover or become in response to what has happened? Zeno's example suggests that even complete loss can become a beginning if we allow it to redirect us rather than only seeking to restore what was taken. This does not mean abandoning practical efforts to rebuild or recover. It means remaining open to the possibility that the life we are redirected toward might be more valuable than the life we lost, even if we would never have chosen the method of transition. Philosophy, in the Stoic sense, is training for exactly these moments. It is preparation for shipwreck, for loss, for the disruptions that reveal how much of what we rely on is actually beyond our control. This preparation is not about becoming indifferent or detached. It is about developing the wisdom to distinguish between what can be lost and what cannot, between what depends on external circumstance and what depends on the quality of our own character and understanding. The practice of premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity, served this preparatory function. By imagining in advance the losses and challenges that might occur, by mentally rehearsing how we would respond if disaster struck, the Stoics trained themselves not to be shattered by the actual arrival of misfortune. Not because they became callous or unfeeling, but because they recognized in advance that these events are possible, that they fall within the range of what happens to human beings, that encountering them does not mean something has gone terribly wrong with the universe. Zeno did not have the benefit of this practice before his shipwreck. He encountered disaster unprepared by philosophy, but his response created the tradition that would prepare countless others. The school he founded taught people how to navigate loss, how to maintain their character and wisdom in the face of circumstances beyond their control, how to find stability not in external fortune but in internal excellence. This teaching spread through the ancient world, adapted and refined by generations of Stoic philosophers, eventually reaching even the highest positions of power. Marcus Aurelius, writing his meditations while leading the Roman Empire through plague and war, returned again and again to these foundational Stoic principles. He reminded himself that external events are indifferent, that his true good lay in his responses rather than his circumstances, that the universe follows its own patterns regardless of his preferences. He was not writing these reminders because he had achieved perfect wisdom and no longer needed guidance. He was writing them because the work of philosophy is never finished, because even the most advanced practitioners need to return to the basics, to remember what matters when pressures and difficulties make it easy to forget. Seneca, writing from his own experiences of exile and political danger, emphasized the same themes. He wrote about the importance of preparing for adversity, of not building our happiness on foundations that can be shaken, of cultivating the inner resources that remain available even when everything external is stripped away. His letters and essays address specific people facing specific challenges, but they spoke to the universal human situation, to the fact that loss and difficulty are woven into the fabric of existence for everyone. Epictetus, who began his philosophical life as a slave, taught from the most intimate knowledge of powerlessness and constraint. He knew what it meant to be subject to forces entirely beyond his control, to have his body and his time and his freedom determined by another person's will. Yet he taught that even in such circumstances, the capacity for wisdom remained intact, that the essential freedom of the human being could not be taken away because it resided in the quality of one's thinking and willing rather than in external circumstances. These three philosophers, writing in different times and different situations, all drew from the well that Zeno first discovered in the aftermath of his shipwreck. They developed and refined the teachings that emerged under the painted porch. They applied Stoic principles to the specific challenges of their historical moments. But they all returned to the same fundamental insight, that wisdom is found not in controlling circumstances but in perfecting our responses to circumstances, that virtue is the only reliable good because it alone depends entirely on our own efforts and understanding. As we come to the close of this extended reflection, we find ourselves returned to beginnings. The story of Zeno's shipwreck is not merely historical biography. It is a pattern that recurs in every life, a structure that each of us encounters in our own way. We experience our losses, small and large. We face our moments when the familiar collapses and we stand in unfamiliar territory with nothing certain to guide us. We encounter the limits of our control and the indifference of circumstance to our plans and preferences. What we do in those moments shapes the trajectory of our lives more than the moments of success and smooth sailing. It is easy to maintain our composure when things go well, when our efforts are rewarded, when fortune smiles and circumstances cooperate. The test comes when the storm arrives, when the ship goes down, when we lose what we valued and find ourselves starting again from nothing or close to nothing. Philosophy offers no protection against these storms, promises no exemption from loss or suffering. What it offers instead is a framework for understanding what is happening, a set of principles for organizing our responses, a way of maintaining our character and wisdom even when everything else is stripped away. It offers the possibility of saying, as Zeno said, that fortune has driven us to something more valuable than what we lost, that the disaster became a redirection toward wisdom. The painted porch is long gone, the columns and roof and painted panels lost to time. Zeno's voice has been silent for more than 2 millennia. The ancient world that gave birth to Stoicism has vanished into history. But the teachings remain alive because they address something permanent in the human condition, something that does not change with technology or culture or historical circumstance. We still face loss. We still encounter the limits of our control. We still need wisdom to navigate the turbulent waters of existence. The story of how Stoicism was born from disaster reminds us that philosophy is not abstract speculation disconnected from real life. It is tested and refined in actual experience, in the crucible of genuine difficulty. Zeno did not develop his teaching in comfortable isolation. He developed it while rebuilding his life from nothing, while trying to understand what had happened to him and what it meant, while searching for something that could not be shipwrecked. Each of us inherits the possibility of that same search. We inherit the questions that Zeno asked and the answers he began to formulate. We inherit the tradition that grew from those first teachings under the painted porch, the accumulated wisdom of generations of Stoic philosophers who tested these principles against every kind of adversity and found them sound. The integration of this wisdom into our lives is not a single event but an ongoing practice. We do not read about Stoicism once and thereby become Stoic. We return to the principles repeatedly. We apply them to new situations. We discover their depth gradually, layer by layer, as we encounter challenges that require us to distinguish what truly matters from what merely seems to matter, what we can control from what we cannot, what depends on external fortune from what depends on the quality of our character. The voyage continues as it always has. The waters remain unpredictable. Storms will come. Ships will founder. We will face our own versions of Zeno's shipwreck, our own encounters with loss and disruption and the sudden collapse of what we had built or planned. These moments ask everything of us. They ask whether we have cultivated the wisdom to respond well, whether we have prepared ourselves through practice and reflection, whether we understand where our true good resides. The answer is not given once and held forever. It is renewed in each situation, refined through each application, deepened through each encounter with difficulty. Philosophy, in this sense, is not a destination we reach but a way of traveling, a method of navigation that serves us especially when the familiar landmarks disappear and we must rely on something internal, something cultivated, something that remains available regardless of external circumstances. May we find, as Zeno found, that what seems like misfortune can redirect us toward wisdom. May we discover that the losses we suffer create space for growth we would not have otherwise pursued. May we learn to distinguish between what can be taken from us and what cannot. May we cultivate the character and understanding that remain stable through all the changes and chances of existence. The painted porch is gone, but its teachings remain, offered freely to all who seek them, as accessible now as they were in ancient Athens, as relevant to our storms as they were to Zeno's shipwreck.